Matthew 27, we're going to continue the study of this gospel. And I'm going to have Tracy put a picture up there on the screen. This is Anjanette Welk. Have you seen this picture this past week? Mike's nodding. A couple of you may have seen her. So this is a person who is right now considered probably the worst person on earth. On May 10th, a little over a week ago, she was driving drunk in Ocala, Florida, and she says she dropped her phone and she reached down to pick it up, and when she looked up, there was a car right in front of her that she slammed into that was stopped at a stoplight behind a tractor trailer, and so she forced that other car right into the tractor trailer, and tragically, the passenger in that other vehicle, 60-year-old woman, was critically injured and later would go on to die from her injuries. This is the mugshot of Anjanette Welk taken the day she was arrested there for DUI, and probably she will face charges of DUI manslaughter now. So, really tragic, really sad, and here she is smiling ear to ear, and so you can imagine the outrage. As I read an article about it, and I noticed, of course, the tone with which the writer wrote the article, and then beneath, as is often the case nowadays, are all these comments of people just weighing in, and people are saying all sorts of things like, death penalty, please. She's a monster, an animal. On that day, what happened was basically someone who was guilty of an extreme crime, who apparently, at least in the moment, was taking it lightly. She went on with her life, and we'll see what happens in terms of the charges. But meanwhile, another woman who was minding her own business, basically innocent, is now gone. So tragic and bothersome. And I don't know what you're thinking, what you feel on the inside when you look at a picture like that. I felt all sorts of things: anger, disgust. This is a deplorable person, right? And then because of what I was studying in Matthew 27, I began thinking about the gospel. And how another injustice, another substitution is what makes it possible for me to be saved, for me to be forgiven, for me to experience God's mercy. A far better, and in another way, far worse injustice in terms of what happens with Jesus at the very end of his life. And that's where we are in Matthew 27. And this morning, we're looking at this passage where there is a well-known story about the infamous Barabbas and Jesus, and how Jesus takes the place of Barabbas, and Barabbas gets to go free. And we're going to consider this reality that Jesus takes our place so that we get to go free, which, when you stop and think about it, is truly amazing. Again, when you think about Anjanette Welk and the human reaction, response, and emotions, which are appropriate and natural and normal, and then to think that in the courtroom of God, that we are guilty, that we have our own crimes which are incalculable, and yet God placed our guilt on his Son so that we can go free. The innocent dies for the guilty. I mean, it's a storyline that no human mind would ever invent. And so we're going to consider the gospel again this morning in Matthew 27 here. First of all, I want to talk about the charges, okay? The charges against Jesus when he stands before Pilate. And what's been happening in terms of context, just to remind you, is once he was taken out of the garden, he's been dragged before different authority figures, religious authorities, and now he's before a political authority figure, Pilate, who's the governor of Judea. He's appointed by the emperor of Rome to be governor over Judea and to keep the peace there in Judea. Okay? So it says in verse 11, that's what we'll start. Verse 11, now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said to him, it is as you say. So here are the charges. Basically treason. Are you claiming to be the king of the Jews? That's what's said about you, Jesus. Is that the case? And he says, literally it's two words, you say. And you might notice in your Bible, there might be some italics there. It is as you say. It's Jesus saying, yeah, basically you said it yourself. Yeah, that's the way it is. And that's one of the only responses Jesus gives. There's all sorts of accusations being hurled at him. We know he's innocent, and as an innocent man, he stands there, and he's just bearing the brunt of all these accusations, and he says essentially nothing except this little statement, you said it yourself. That's the case. And read on, and it will describe here his silence. Verse 12, and while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. You've been on the hot seat before, I'm sure. And maybe you had some guilt, and maybe you were willing to own up for that guilt, but there was also maybe accusations that were part of that weren't true, and you defended yourself. You know what that feels like when someone is falsely accusing you. There's this knee-jerk reaction to get the truth out there. Wait a minute, this isn't fair, this isn't right. To defend yourself. That's what all of us do naturally, especially when there isn't any guilt on our part or when we're unaware of any guilt on our part. Here we see abnormal, foreign submission and yieldedness on Christ's part. And this is just a side note, but if you consider why he's able to be silent, why he's able to be a sheep silent before its shears, led to slaughter, how does he remain silent? He knows the plan, doesn't he? He knows the bigger picture. He's submitting, isn't he, to his Father's plan and recognizes that this, as horrible as it was part of that plan. And it says that Pilate, right at the end of verse 14, he was amazed. He was marveling over this. He's never seen anything like this. He's seen lots of criminals brought before him in his day. He's never seen something like this. He's receiving, letting it play out, not defending himself. It's amazing security. It's amazing stability. It's like nothing Pilate's ever seen before. And as we'll see as we read on, Pilate's suspicious that this man is in fact innocent. So let's consider now this custom. This is an interesting custom here, okay? So verse 15, it says, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ? For he knew that because of envy they had handed him over. So he says this is custom. And it's a little bit tricky. As I read about it and tried to dig into the history here, it's not crystal clear, but it seems as though there was a custom among the Jewish people, kind of this agreement with the Roman authorities, that during Passover, the Roman authorities would hand over, pardon a criminal. And the Jews were able to choose which criminal would be released. This is what some call paschal amnesty. So the word paschal is from the Greek word which is translated Passover, having to do with the Passover, that season, that important feast for the Jewish people. It goes all the way back to the Exodus. During that season, there was amnesty granted. Now that word amnesty, those of you who are in touch with political debates in our day, you've heard that term. It has to do with, especially today, it has to do with immigrants and how are they to be treated. And the concept of amnesty is basically forgiving, pardoning, liberating those who are guilty of some kind of political offense. In the case of immigration, they're here illegally, and so when you hear about a president granting amnesty, he is freeing them. And part of that freedom is there's no concern that charge will ever be raised against them in the future. They're cleared of that. And so as you can imagine, there's a sort of heated debate going on about that. Again, most of you are familiar with it. Okay, so this is a form of amnesty in those days, was saying someone who is guilty is allowed to go free. And Pilate now puts it before the people, who do you want me to release? Barabbas, who, as you may have noticed, it says was a notorious prisoner, really a scoundrel, or Jesus. Let me say a couple things about Barabbas, because they're not explicitly stated here, but the other Gospels tell us some about this guy. Okay, what's he like? What's his sort of bio? Barabbas was an insurrectionist. He was a murderer. Insurrection was the violent uprising against the Roman authorities, and he participated in that. He was a political criminal. Probably some of the Jewish people would have considered him kind of a hero because he was willing to courageously stand against the Roman authorities and even to kill, put his own life on the line. Maybe would have viewed him as a hero, but yet he was truly, clearly a criminal and in many respects a scoundrel. And Pilate had at this time reserved for Barabbas and the other two men with whom Jesus is crucified, he has crosses established, 3 crosses for these 3 criminals. And now he says, hey, who do you want me to release? Do you want me to release this Barabbas, or do you want me to release Jesus, who is the Christ? And here again, Pilate is kind of tipping his hand, showing, look, assuming they will want to release Jesus. It's a no-brainer. And he says he knew that because of envy they had turned him over, or handed him over, so he's guessing, well, they're not going to want this guy to be killed. Maybe he's caused a little stir. Maybe there's a little jealousy among the religious leaders, but surely they're not going to want him to be executed. So he leaves it in their court. He leaves it up to them. What is Jesus guilty of? You think about that. What did he do? Came humbly, lived the first 30 years of his life quietly, working as a carpenter, serving, paying his taxes, continued to encourage people even during his ministry, even as he was proclaiming the truth and showing himself to be the Messiah, still encouraging people to submit to the government, to pay their taxes. Really a model citizen, if there ever was a model citizen on earth, he was the model citizen. Loving, serving, healing, on and on and on. Really kind of an embodiment of the goodness of God, the explosion of mercy onto the scene of depraved humanity. Every second of his life. It's amazing. He's lived that way. The word innocent doesn't seem to even capture what we're talking about in terms of Christ's purity of motives. As you consider yourself, Don talked about it in Sunday school for those who are in there, this constant warfare that we are experiencing in our heads every day, battling with what we want and who's threatening what we want, who's in our way. All of that goes on constantly, fighting for our way. And here we have Jesus submitting to his Father's plan, loving, serving. It is amazing. Innocence like this world has never seen. And what do they choose? Verse 19. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife, Pilate's wife, sent him a message saying, have nothing to do with that righteous man. Who's the righteous man? Jesus. The Old Testament, I think it's in Isaiah, it talks about the righteous one. Who is the righteous one? Who's the right one? In all the ways I just described, Jesus is the right one. And isn't it interesting? She had this dream. It's like God is giving them every opportunity to recognize who this guy is. So she pleads with Pilate, have nothing to do with him. In other words, leave him alone. Probably implication, let him go. Don't prosecute. Don't convict. She says, last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. She was like stirred on the inside. Verse 20, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. But the governor said to them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? And they said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them, then what shall I do with Jesus who is called the Christ? They all said in unison, crucify him. And he said, why? What evil has he done? But they kept shouting all the more, saying, crucify him. And you get this impression that Pilate is kind of pleading with them. Hey guys, don't you realize what's going on here? We got this criminal who's clearly guilty, who deserves to die. The law says he should die. And then we have an innocent man that you're jealous of. Maybe got a little jealousy. I mean, are you kidding me? What do you want me to do? And you get the sense he's pleading with them kind of ongoing. And they are shouting more and more in unison, tenaciously, crucify him. Kill him. Bloodthirsty. It doesn't even make sense. On just a rational, logical level, it doesn't make sense. What did he ever do to them? Possibly, probably, these are the same people, at least some of them same people who just a week earlier were hailing him as king during the triumphal entry, showing human fickleness. When they think he can produce and give them what they want, hey, he's king. Hooray. When they see him in humiliation, losing, as it were, accused, when the leaders whom they esteem say, oh, this man's dangerous, this man's a threat. I mean, just the fickleness. They just go within what the leaders say. They were persuaded. This is why it's so important for all of us to think critically. We so quickly glom onto a message and a movement and a leader. We're sheep, right? We're sheep. And Jesus spoke the truth and embodied the truth, and yet here he is in his darkest hour, and he's being forsaken and abandoned. And here they are crying out, crucify him. As we've said before, back in the Garden of Eden, when original sin took place and God said, the day you eat from that, you'll surely die. And Romans 1 says, we all know deep down because of that guilt, when we have any trace of awareness of that guilt, we know that there's a worthiness of death. And we try to turn the tables on God, and here's what they're doing, saying, no, you deserve to die. God in the flesh is there, and they say to God, crucify him. Kill him. And I know in my mind and in your mind too, it's hard to even relate to that, and you can't imagine saying that. You can't imagine opposing him, and I can't either. And yet this is indicative of the human condition. If God tampered with enough stuff in your life, if he messed with your kingdom enough, there is this uprising, this insurrection that happens in our hearts, just like Barabbas, an insurrectionist working against the governing authorities. There's part of us that works against the governing authority of God in our lives, whether that be the traffic that we're stuck in or the things that go wrong in our lives that we don't like. There is still that human DNA there that just rises up against, and we are desperately in need of a substitute, an innocent one in our place. One who submits, one who yields, one who loves, even in his darkest hour, even when people are most violently opposing him. And that's what we see in Jesus Christ. And it is, like I said earlier, like nothing else we're ever going to see in this world. It's like no other story a human mind would invent. This is the gospel, and it's amazing. And Jesus just stands here and takes it, because it's part of the plan. So let's look at the conclusion of the matter here. Okay? Verse 24 on to 26, the last few verses. When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves. And all the people said, his blood shall be on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. I said earlier, Pilate's job was to keep the peace. You know what that's like, moms and dads in your home? when chaos is erupting and you just want to keep the peace. And sometimes you're strategic and you're thinking, what can I do? Just make this stop. Maybe if, in my mind, it's usually, maybe I can just separate them. I'll just get, put one kid in this corner of the house and the other kid is far on the top floor, farthest corner from that first kid. Just get them apart, right? Just get things quieted down. Can we just get peace here? And sometimes you're just scrambling, trying to find any way to make this stop. Well, that was Pilate's job, and he was at risk here of losing his job if he didn't keep the peace. So even though on the inside he suspected this Jesus was innocent, he didn't have the courage to stand against these people. He had to give them what they wanted, to quell the mob, the riot that was starting to form. And so he does, but he says, and this is where it's kind of like trying to get the best of both worlds here, is he says, fine, you can have what you want, and he says, I wash my hands of this. He's saying, really, I don't approve of this. I don't agree with this. He too is a coward, and that he's putting himself, his own security, his own position, his own interest before Jesus, but verbally at least he's saying, I don't think this guy is guilty. I think he's innocent. And he'll go on later, and isn't it ironic and amazing how God works? Well, he'll go on to put this sign over Jesus which says, King of the Jews. And they'll even say, hey, no, change it to he claimed to be king. He's, nope, what I've written, I've written. Fascinating. And they say in verse 25, his blood shall be on us and on our children. Hey, fine, we welcome the responsibility because we believe we're doing the right thing. Jesus says back in John's gospel that those who persecute you will think they're doing God a service. And in one sense, these people were thinking, well, we got to stop this guy, and even for God's sake, we've got to stop this guy. How ironic. So they say, hey, fine, his blood shall be on us and on our children. Hey, in a way, we want credit for this decision. This was the right decision. This is the right call. It's just human blinders and human deception. It's really sad. And so he released Barabbas for them. He had Jesus scourged, whipped with, you've seen those leather straps that had bone or fragments of lead attached to them, and just pulling the flesh from Christ's side. He went through that beating, which would sometimes kill a criminal. He endured that, then he was handed over to be crucified. God dies in nakedness, humiliation, shame, and guilt, even though he's innocent. That's what happened, and Barabbas gets to go free, doesn't he? And we don't know anything about his life beyond this point. We have no idea what he did with that freedom, but we know he got to go free. And when you think about Barabbas, and I think about Barabbas, we ought to think about ourselves. When you look at Barabbas, that's you, that's me. An insurrectionist, a sovereign, a murderous sovereign, even one who experiences anger when I don't get my way, when you don't get your way. Those traces of, and sometimes more than traces, sometimes explosions of rebellion. In that abiding, remaining flesh, those reminders of why we need a substitute, why we need an innocent one to step in for us. To have God treat Jesus like us so that he can treat us like Jesus, so that he can say, you are righteous, you are forgiven, you are free, you've been placed in the status of amnesty. It's amazing, and I want you to think, this is fascinating, how the consistency of this book, the harmony of this book. I mean, put your thinking cap on for a second. From the very beginning, all the way back in Genesis, to the end of this book, God over and over and over again communicates to us that he has determined to give us a substitute in death. Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they eat from that tree. God says, you eat from it, you're going to surely, what? Die. They eat from the tree. They didn't die that day, did they? You know who or you know what died that day? An animal God killed in order to take the skin and cover them. In a very real sense, that animal was a substitute for Adam and Eve. Fast forward. Abraham, patriarch. God says, offer your son Isaac, the promised son. Abraham scratched his head and turmoil on the inside. What are you talking about? What? offer my son. This is the promised son. This is the one whom through all these other descendants are going to be born. And I mean, we need him. And God says, no, take his life. And then just before Abraham's about to do it, God says, oh, stop. And there's a ram in the thicket. And he says, no, that's your substitute. That's the offering. That ram will experience death. The Israelites are captives in Egypt, and they cry out to God for help. And God enacts all these plagues there in Egypt as a sign and a warning to Pharaoh, showing his power, saying, let my people go. And then the end, after Pharaoh wouldn't listen, Passover is going to be the death of the firstborn. And God says to his people, you take a lamb, you kill it, you take that blood, put it on your doorpost, and I will pass over. And so that lamb was a substitute, wasn't it, in death? The lamb loses its life so that the people, the sons, would not. And then God brings his people, Israelites, through the Red Sea, parts the waters, they get through to the other side, and then as the Egyptian armies follow them in hot pursuit, ready to murder them, God brings the waters back over the Egyptians, and it kills all the Egyptians. And then it says, as you read there in Exodus, when the Israelites looked back, they saw the carcasses of the dead Egyptian soldiers on the beach. And what must have occurred to at least some of them was, hey, you know what, that could have been me. There's a substitute in death. And on and on and on it goes. And in the Old Testament sacrificial system, lambs, rams, bulls, goats, doves were killed. Countless animals were killed sacrificially. Blood was spilled. Couldn't even measure it. All this clear message from God, I am going to solve your death problem. You're worthy of death. You deserve to die. I am going to solve that problem for you. I'm going to give you a substitute in death. And then we see the fulfillment of all of those types and shadows and prophecies in Christ, who comes and takes your place and my place and takes upon himself our guilt. I mean, you think about the picture I showed you earlier. It's not still up there. Good. That would be distracting to have her big, grinny smile up there the whole time. I mean, the despicable, disgusting person she is. Hard to imagine that we are as guilty before God, that we're in our depravity, in our rebellion, in our self-love, in our exploitation of others, in our impatience, in our frustration, in our anxiety, and everything else, that we are ugly in guilt. And how beautiful and amazing that God says, I have taken all that away from you and placed it on my son, the innocent one, for you. I'm going to try to drive that just a little bit deeper before I close. I mean, I want you to think about someone you consider the worst person in the world. Maybe it's somebody you know. Maybe it's, a family member, a neighbor that's driving you crazy right now, somebody at work, someone who did some things you can't even imagine ever doing or even being tempted to do. And to you, it's just disgusting, horrible. And if you've conjured someone to mind, pretty safe bet it's not you yourself you're thinking of. Pretty safe bet you're thinking of someone else. So let's just stick with that person. The substitution given for them. The offer of pardon, forgiveness. The promise of never holding that sin against them. I mean, when I think about the worst of the worst, the people that I despise the most, I can't imagine not ever holding that against them at all in the slightest way for the rest of my existence. I can't even imagine that. And because God knows that concept is so foreign to us and doesn't make any human sense, because he knows his ways are far higher than our ways and his thoughts than our thoughts, he says, I'm giving you a flesh and blood example / provision for you to know you have my pardon. For you to know that he came in flesh and blood, as it says in Hebrews 2, to taste death for you and for me, to take upon himself the ugliness of guilt and shame and condemnation, to take it so that you and I can listen to this, okay? Can just go free and just go live your life, just like Barabbas. What? And there's a very real sense in which, even though we talk about all the time here at our church, we want us to be sensitive to those deeper layers of our sin, to see that from which God has rescued us, to be liberated in those areas where we're still held captive by the lies and the enslaving, deceptive, sinful patterns, to be seeing them more clearly, and then to be, as we're seeing them, having God apply his gospel truth to every one of those levels, because in a very real sense, God has already said to you, just like Barabbas, you're free. And so along with that, even though we struggle and can obsess over and try incessantly, and I do and you do, to fix, to manage, to get a handle on sin and guilt, and to make it stop, and to make the shame that goes along with that, to eliminate that. I mean, on it goes. And here in this text and in basically every other text in the Bible, God's saying, I've made provision for you fully. For freedom, Christ has set us free. So go live your life. And ironically, even though that sounds like, well, that's not a license, that's actually where love comes from. Because if you got a close enough look at any other person, if you really saw that person, if you really spent a lot of time with that person, whoever it was the worst in your head, anybody else could be in that position very quickly and very easily. And the only thing that's going to be any kind of counter influence to that is this message right here, where God says, this is how I've loved you. This is what I've done for you. Which is why Jesus says, now go and love as I have loved you. So Barabbas is you. Barabbas is me. Anjanette Welk is you. Anjanette Welk is me. And our hope is in a substitute, an innocent one. And God says, be amazed. He made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness, the innocence of God in him. Pray God presses that into your heart, soul, and mind, and into your kids. And that the spillover would be a reactive love and appreciation for God, an amazement and a worship of him, and a reactive mercy and grace and love for the dirtbags in your life. The miracle of grace would be seen and known. People would, just like Pilate, marvel over Jesus. Let's pray. God, thank you for your word and these stories that we know a human mind couldn't come up with. The wonder of the gospel, the mystery of the gospel, and we're sitting here in a little church, outskirts of Olympia, and we are thinking on, and in a way apprehending your truth And God, we're confronted with you as a sovereign king over every aspect of our lives. And God, there's so many blinders as we go our way, and even blinders to your character and ways we misunderstand you. And there are damaging results of that, works, deeds of the flesh that are destructive and deadly. And God, you've given us this message of pardon and forgiveness. And we think of Christ going to the cross, hanging between two criminals and taking the place of Barabbas and taking my place. And God, I confess to you, I don't even grasp a small measure of how great it is to be forgiven by you. But I'm thankful that you're committed to teaching me, and I pray that you would teach all of us the greatness of being safe in your love and care, fatherly shepherding care in our lives. Help us to see that the message of the cross, even though it's foolishness to the world, help us to see that it may seem humanly foolish, but it is our only hope. And to experience the fruit of gratitude, security, stability, and even the fruit of love for others. In Christ's name.